The book of First Enoch is interesting.
All right, let's see it.
It tells us a lot about what Jews, particularly in the time around Jesus, were thinking about things like angels and demons, and there's sort of this apocalyptic flavor to it.
Another way to put this would be to point out that the book of First Enoch and the Enochic narratives and traditions directly influence the way the New Testament and early Christianity understood angels, demons, Satan, heaven, hell, and the eschaton.
Beyond that, we do know that the Jews of Jesus' time did not consider it scripture.
Pure and utter nonsense. There are no data that one can marshal to demonstrate that the Jews of Jesus' time did not believe it was scripture. The data that we do have that is suggestive of the status of First Enoch suggests that it was considered scripture, at least by some folks. For instance, at Qumran, we find 11 copies of some version of the book of First Enoch just in Cave 4 alone. That is more copies than we have of the minor prophets, of Samuel, of Kings, of Jeremiah, of any of the other books apart from the Pentateuch, Isaiah, and the Psalms. So it was incredibly important at Qumran. Jubilees is also incredibly important at Qumran. 14 copies of that were found there. And then we have in the New Testament the letter of Jude, where First Enoch is directly cited and quoted as prophecy. So let's take a look at this passage. Verse 13 is talking about the disobedient angels for whom the deepest darkness has been reserved forever. Verse 14, it was also about these that Enoch, in the 7th generation from Adam, prophesied, saying, see, the Lord is coming with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all and to convict all the ungodly of all the deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him. So not only is this directly quoting First Enoch, and Enoch is influential on the rest of Jude's letter, by the way. There are other references to the Enochic tradition. This is explicitly described as prophecy. This is prophetic literature. What is Scripture, if not prophetic literature?
We do know that the Jews considered it a valuable piece of literature, like other valuable pieces of literature. But I think just because Jude quotes it doesn't then necessitate that it is scripture, any more than when Paul quotes philosophers, when he quotes Greco-Roman philosophers, that he thinks those are scripture.
This is a bit misleading because Paul never says that any of those philosophers prophesied, but what the author of the letter of Jude quotes from First Enoch is explicitly described as a prophecy, as something that the author was inspired to prophesy.
The book doesn't need to be inspired to be useful, and Enoch appears to be both common enough for Jude to quote it in his epistle, assuming his audience knew what was being talked about and that the stories within it contained kernels of truth that Jude is willing to draw from.
But what the author of Jude quotes from First Enoch is something that they explicitly describe as a prophecy, which would need to be inspired. Let's take a look at what some other scholars who discuss the biblical canon have said about this. For instance, Lee Martin MacDonald's The Formation of the Biblical Canon, I and many scholars would argue is probably the most authoritative discussion on the development of the concept of an Old Testament canon. And MacDonald starts here. Beckwith argues that Jude saw this literature merely as edifying, but not as sacred scripture. However, his reasoning does not show an awareness of how prophetic literature was understood in antiquity or how Jude appealed to First Enoch as one who has prophesied. Prophets who are inspired by the Spirit prophesy. Jude bases his warning of judgment on the reliability and inspiration of First Enoch. Is there any example of a writing classified as prophetic that was not considered divinely inspired scripture? That is what scripture is. And then MacDonald goes on, Jude clearly cites First Enoch as a prophetic text, stating that Enoch prophesied. Namely, he cited it as a spirit-led text and as sacred scripture. By most definitions of scripture, this is a reference to sacred scripture. If Jude thought the passage was spoken through prophecy, he also saw it as inspired and as scripture. It is special pleading to suggest otherwise. We can look at other folks who are talking about the role of Enoch in the development of the concept of Scripture and canon. Timothy Lim, in the formation of the Jewish canon, says the letter of Jude cited 1 Enoch as prophetic literature and considered its authority in a way no different from other New Testament texts. Now let's further address this claim that we know the Jewish folks of Jesus' day did not accept 1 Enoch as scripture. I want to look at the canon debate edited by Lee Martin MacDonald and James Sanders, which talks about how we really don't know much about what they considered scripture in the 1st century CE. James Vanderkam has questions of canon viewed through the Dead Sea Scrolls. He begins, as nearly as we can tell, there was no canon of scripture in Second Temple Judaism. That is, before 70 CE, no authoritative body of which we know drew up a list of books that alone were regarded as supremely authoritative, a list from which none could be subtracted and to which none could be added. There is nothing new or surprising in a statement such as this. This is just the scholarly consensus. On the very last page of Vanderkam's article, in view of the evidence from Qumran, we should avoid using the words Bible and biblical for this period and this community. This is not to deny the group had authoritative writings. The difficulty is that we, at our remove of a couple of thousand years, cannot always be sure which of those writings were authoritative and which were not. We do not know which books the word Torah embraced. Therefore, we should follow the ancient practice of using more general, less suggestive terms, such as scriptures and rewritten scriptures instead of Bible and rewritten Bible. And in this paper, Vanderkam goes through to show that texts like Jubilees at Qumran seem to tag our bases for what was considered scripture, but certainly not what was a closed canon. And since we're already in this volume, we can look at Craig Evans' paper, The Scriptures of Jesus and His Earliest Followers, and this part at the end is pretty instructive. Jesus, like the sectarians at Qumran, evidently regarded the Psalms as inspired scripture, possibly because they were in some sense prophetic. So, at least for Craig Evans, the prophetic nature of a text was determinative of its identification as scripture. So, the claim that the Jewish folks of Jesus' day did not accept 1 Enoch as scripture is pure and utter nonsense. There are no data that can be marshaled to support the plausibility, much less the certainty of that claim. That is not something anyone can declare that we know about the Jewish folks of Jesus' day. Certainly, there were many Jewish folks who did accept it as scripture. Now, while there were certainly going to be those who did not, one of the people who did accept it as scripture wrote a text that ended up in the New Testament. And so, if you accept the letter of Jude as inspired scripture, then you must at least recognize that that inspired author accepted 1 Enoch as inspired scripture as well. What you do with that is entirely up to you. But what is clear is that the claim that the Jewish folks of Jesus' day didn't accept it as scripture is, again, just pure and utter nonsense. And the fit for this video is Hellboy.